Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the EG4 6000 XP. This inverter is manufactured by LuxPower, the same company that manufactures the EG4 18K PV, if you've seen any of my videos on that. The 18K PV is a hybrid inverter, and this is an off-grid inverter. So this is not meant to backfeed the grid or have any kind of grid interactive features other than the grid being a backup. So you can use the grid as a bypass if the batteries are low, or if you want to charge with the grid, you can do that with this inverter. So some of the stats on this inverter, it can utilize 8,000 watts of solar. So it's a 6,000 watt inverter split phase, so you can run 240 or 120 on here. Like I said, it can utilize 8,000 watts of solar. So if you're using 6,000 watts, then you still have 2,000 watts you can be charging with. So that's pretty cool. So this is an all-in-one inverter, and I think it actually lives up to its namesake more than some of the other low-budget inverters. It has a lot of the breakers and disconnects already integrated into the inverter, whereas you had to buy them separately with some of the other ones. And all-in-one meaning that it has the MPPT, the charge controller, and inverter all in one. So one of the things I really like about the 18K PV is being able to look at things remotely, or being able to do remote firmware updates. And or if EG4 needs to take a look at anything, you can have them look at it remotely and take care of something. And the 6000 XP would be the same, so you can do remote firmware updates and you can monitor the unit that way. So before I get too far away from talking about the charge controller, the solar charge controller, this has a 480 volt VOC limit. And like I mentioned before, it can utilize 8,000 watts. So similar to a 6500 in that respect, they could utilize 8,000 watts also. So I'll probably do some flashbacks first and show you guys what came in the box and maybe me hanging it up a little bit. And then I'll show you the internals here and see if we can hook stuff up and get this started. All right, so inside the box, it comes with a template. So I would probably, and I'm probably going to measure how far the screen is from the top and use that to determine where I want it to be eye level. And here it shows you here where you're going to have your screws. And of course the manual. So that, if it's anything like, yeah, so that's the parallel cable. I was going to say this would be the battery cable. It looked like the one from the 18K PV, but that is the parallel cable and that's the battery cable. They're labeled. And the Wi-Fi dongle. By the way, this uses the same dongle as the 18K PV, so that makes it a lot easier. So it's not very hard to set up. If you've seen anything on setting up the wireless dongle on the 18K PV, it would, I believe, just be the same exact setup, same way you do it. I did not know that it came with handles. That is really neat. Also, it did come with some wedge anchors here to mount it to block or brick if you needed to. There's some other bolts in here as well. So looking at the outside of the inverter, I still got to hook the dongle in. And here is EPS output or AC output. So that's currently off. Here's the stats for the inverter. You guys can always pause it and focus in and see all that. The breakers I've already mentioned. Over on the right side, you've got the filter. So this is looks like 4 screws to take the filter off here for this one. And PV disconnect right here. And an on-off switch for the inverter itself. All right, so now that we got it popped open, I can see where the 2 bolts here that came in the bag with those wedge anchors, where they go. They're for the battery positive and negative. And they look like M8 bolts. Let me see if I can find it in the manual. I don't see anything specifically in there. I'm probably just missing it, but you should be fine with a 5/16 or a 1/4 inch lug on there. And as far as wire size, it recommends a 1 gauge but it looks like, I'm sure you could go larger, so 2-aught or whatever it is you guys are comfortable with. So anything 1 gauge and above for the DC. And like I mentioned before, you have disconnects and breakers on here already integrated. So this is your battery breaker here. This is your load. That's grid, and that's generator. Over here is the PV input 1 and 2. And then here you have your neutral and your ground. I also see in the manual they have torque specs for the DC, the battery cables, which is good. Over here, there's the connections for battery communication and parallel communication. There's also dry contact for a generator. And it looks like a terminal for a rapid shutdown device to be put in here also. So that's cool. I need to read more about that part in the manual. So I was going to use that large breakout, but I might use just these smaller ones here and use some of the glands that I have to run the battery cables through, just for testing. And then we'll see if we can hook the PV up also. So I already had these bus bars set up from testing the EG4 3000 watt inverter. And these are coming from one of the smaller battery cabinets, one of the 3 rack battery cabinets, and I have 3 EG4 LL batteries in there. So that's what I'm going to be hooking this to now. These are the current connected bus bars. I still think for a small system, or even really a medium-sized system, these are a really nice option. I'm putting another gland in for the PV. For now, I'm going to run just into the first input, PV1. If you're using fine stranded PV wire, which is pretty common, make sure to get a crimper, a ferrule crimper. Super cheap on Amazon. I can put a link if people need. But yeah, follow the directions on that. Follow the manual, because you don't want it to have excess heat build up because you didn't do that step right. Also, I try to throw this in with as many videos as possible. I guess I'll just keep saying it. Don't mess with your PV if it's connected to the panels. You have a disconnect here in the inverter. There's a PV disconnect here on the side, if you guys didn't see it when I was talking about it before. So that is super helpful. The 18K PV has one also. But I recommend having one at the array. So they are not that expensive. Having one in an easy area where you can disconnect your PV before it gets to the inverter is the way to do it. If you didn't do that, then don't have it plugged in. But either way, do not mess with your PV unless everything is disconnected. It will kill you instantly. Or at least it could kill you. I don't want to make any predictions. If it's evening and there's not a lot of solar, you may just hurt really bad. Yeah, so far I like the placement of everything. This large knockout is going to be where most people put the battery cables through, I think. There's a smaller knockout over here that would work for the battery communications and dry contact stuff, rapid shutdown. And then you've got plenty of other knockouts for PV and the grid input and load and all that. So load is going to be on the far left. I have an off-grid panel that I set up out in the shop here, but I think I'm going to use this SO cable and see if I can run some house loads with the inverter. I think people using this off-grid are going to want to know how well it can start up a water well, and we'll see how it does on the HVAC. I'm putting 6 gauge in here and it fits. It calls for 8 gauge on the input and output, but this is slightly bigger. I don't know, I'm almost finished. I don't know if you guys can hear the 18K next to me. I think we're using close to 8,000 watts from it right now. I think my wife is cooking something. I don't know. All right, so yeah, pretty simple installation overall. Even for beginners, they're not going to struggle with this here. The wiring compartment, there's plenty of room in here to do anything you need. Again, I'm using 2-aught cable. They recommend 1 gauge, so you can go 2-aught like I did, or a little smaller is fine also. There's plenty of room. I know it looks a little odd with the cables kinked like this, but again, if they're coming from the other direction, from the larger knockout, you're probably going to have a pretty similar swoop from the other end, but it's not kinked in here. There's a lot of room, so it's not hard. Again, I'm only using output. Here's the input here from the grid, and here's a generator input. I am not using either one of them. Right now, this is just for the output. I'm going to test the loads. I'm wired to a 50 amp breaker in my panel. That way I can test everything. I do like the PV inputs. I didn't have any problem getting them in. I know with the 6500s, the EG4 6500EX, it was a little bit of a pain, kind of a tiny compartment there to get the PV into. And from what I saw, it was pretty similar on the 6000EX as the 6500. So this is actually a lot easier because you've got this whole compartment to deal with. And grounding and neutral, everything's easy to get to here. So yeah, overall, even for beginners, they may look at it, it may look a little bit complicated in here, but you've just got a few main things to hook into, and you got plenty of space, and everything is well labeled. So I'm going to put the cover back on here in a minute, and then I'll turn the inverter on. All right, so I'm just about to switch the inverter on. I'll turn the battery breaker on, like I've mentioned before in the past, and then we will start the pre-charge resistors in the batteries. All right, so here is this is the small cabinet I mentioned before, the EG4 LL models. This is the V1, version 1. So if you're using the pre-charge resistors here, actually one of the viewers mentioned this to me before because I did it in reverse. I did it quick enough where I didn't have an issue, but you're going to want to switch the breaker on first, then engage the BMS. That way the pre-charge resistor can work in the battery. So should be charged up, and I can turn the inverter on. I'll switch all the other ones on here in just a second, and then we can turn the inverter on. All right, so we should be good to go. I'll switch it on here in just a second. All right, cool. So we are fired up. I'll turn the PV on, but it's nighttime now. It's getting late, so I'm going to have to do the rest of the video tomorrow and the load test. But yeah, I'll focus here on the screen. Let's see what it looks like. What it looks like is dirty. Let's see. Probably satisfying for some of you there. So I've still got to set up. I'm not going to do battery comms right now. I'm going to set it for probably lead acid. And I'll mess with all the settings here and get the Wi-Fi dongle hooked up. And start again tomorrow. I'll show you guys how well, before I end the video, see if I can get it to start my water well and do some load testing. All right, so the shop is being powered by the inverter now. I'm going to call it quits for tonight, but I wanted to show you guys, I switched it to lead acid mode. This was blinking, which was abnormal. Now the little smiley face says it's normal. So you hold this down for 3 seconds, and then you can scroll up to option 3, and then you'll hit enter, and you'll go into the battery mode, and you can choose which mode you'd like. But yeah, wasn't too bad. I think the screen is kind of like it's a mixed bag. It's kind of like a grow watt screen almost in a way. It's certainly better than a 6500 or something like that. I guess if you're used to the 18K PV, which is full color, this is a little different. All right, so let me turn the water well on now and see if it starts that up. It should do that fine, but I think for most people that's going to be something. If they're off grid, they're going to want to know it can run that. So I've got a 3/4 horse deep well pump. Let's see here. Let me switch it on. Didn't have any issue at all. So the water well was not a problem. It didn't have any problem starting up. As a matter of fact, it barely sounded like it went out of idle. So a couple things I wanted to mention about the inverter. So the first is I wanted to show you the template that I showed you guys at the beginning of the video. This is, like I said, it's going to be a time saver for people. You can put where the screen is on the template itself. You can line that up on the wall. Make sure you hit a stud, and if you're putting it in wood, that is, and you can get it at eye level that way. So if you're putting it into masonry, brick, block, stone, concrete, you'll use these wedge anchors like they sent. And with these, it's going to be a little easier. So if you put these in, you're essentially just going to put the inverter up right on the 4 wedge anchors, and then you can put the nut and washer on top. If you're putting it into wood, these brackets that are on the inverter do not have the little notch outs that you'd see like on a 6500 watt inverter or a lot of the other inverters. It just comes with the holes this size, just like this. So you're not going to be able to set it up and settle it down on screws that are screwed in like 3/4 of the way or whatever. You have to hold it up on the wall and screw it in place. So you either need a buddy or a little lift or something to put it up on the wall to screw it in. So that's something I wanted to mention to people. I didn't do it that way. There's a bracket on the back, so I put 2 screws in around halfway and put it up on those screws, and then screwed 2 more on top and did the ones on the bottom. I wouldn't recommend that way, but I would get somebody to help you or get something to hold it up there while you screw it in. I just wanted to give everybody a heads up about that. So the second thing is the display. I'm not a huge fan of the display. It's because it's kind of busy. There's a lot going on with it, which I realize there is a lot that the inverter can do. So it has to be able to put a lot into the display, but I would prefer like a option 1, 2, 3, or 4, something like that, where you could choose kind of a fixed setting where I want to see wattage here, want the panel wattage or panel amperage, something like that, to be able to stay on the screen. So yeah, it's not a deal breaker by any means. It's certainly an improvement on the Voltronics units, the 6500EX, the LV6548, and the 6000EX. I get all these mixed up, but yeah, it's an improvement on them, but I think it would be nice to have that as an option for the display, something a little bit more customizable. So I also wanted to mention the manual is really good at explaining what each setting does. They do a good job on installation as well, but the settings, they do a really good job. They explain very plainly what each setting does in the manual. So I don't think that's going to confuse people. A lot of the other inverters, if you look at the different settings, it can kind of be a little bit, people are kind of confused. But if you read the manual well, carefully, you'll be able to see exactly what each setting is supposed to do and if it applies to you. Also, I'm going to throw a link to Marcus's YouTube page. He is the director for R&D at EG4, and he posted a couple videos of this unit starting up some compressors and stuff like that, so it's pretty neat. I'll be putting some more load tests in the next video. All right, so final thoughts on this video for the 6000 XP. I actually have a lot of thoughts, so I'll probably put some into a follow-up video. I want to do some more testing with it, obviously, and show some more stuff with it. So a big factor is price, and I say that in a lot of my videos, but it's the truth. I mean, it always factors into everyone's decisions on what to buy. So quality-wise, I've been using the 18K PV now for 5-6 months now. I need to do a follow-up video on that, so I'll do that soon enough. But quality-wise, they have that. It's fantastic. So I'm thinking we're going to be looking at something similar here, but time will tell. So we need to see some of these units in parallel. You can parallel up to 16 of these units, which is pretty crazy. But that will kind of tell whether or not they communicate well with each other, if they can operate well with each other. So I'm sure there's going to be some videos of other channels coming out with some of these in parallel. Again, I want to do some more testing and see how much I can pull on one line and see if we can get it to overload and trip a few times. But yeah, back to price. I really cannot believe that this unit is this cheap. Actually, I don't like to use the word cheap. Low cost, I guess, because for what you get with the unit here, it seems pretty incredible. So surge is another big factor. You know, when I use my 6500 watt inverters, they claim that you could go double the wattage for 5 seconds. I never saw that. So they would handle a surge above their wattage limit But anything above that, I mean, anything over a second or less, it would just trip. So they could handle a fraction of a second from what I saw. But after that, they would trip or overload every time. So I never saw that 5 seconds. But this unit here says 3.5 seconds for 12 kilowatts. And then I think it's 5 seconds for 11 kilowatts. So keep in mind, though, these are split phase units. So it's 6,000 watts, yes, but you technically have 3,000 watts per leg. So it's essentially 2 miniature 3,000 watt inverters inside this guy here. So you can't pull much over 3,000 watts. That's what it's rated for. So if you need more than 3,000 watts on one leg, you're going to need 2. But again, with the price, I mean, I think it's crazy cheap to have, or crazy inexpensive, I guess I should say, to have an item like this at the price it is. So while I'm making this video, it's right around $1,400 for one unit. So I know I'm going to probably forget something crucial, but I can throw it into the next video. So I would consider also, depending on your setting, if you don't have Wi-Fi, remember the dongles from the 18K PV work on this also, and I have the cellular dongle for that, and it's still working great. I don't have any issue with that. It's been months now, and I do not have a good signal here in the shop, like I mentioned in my other video on setting up the cellular dongle for that, and it works great. So keep in mind, if you want to be able to monitor the unit, if you don't have Wi-Fi, that's definitely an option. You can get one of them. Also, while we're on the subject, I mentioned before towards the beginning of the video about setting it up, it being the same as the 18K PV, but now they have it where you can set everything up with your cell phone. You don't even have to use, before when I set it up originally, I had to use a laptop, and now they have it set up to where you can use your cell phone to get the dongle working. And in the next video, I can show you guys the monitoring setup. It's the same, pretty similar as the 18K PV. So, but yeah, it shows all your stats, and you can change settings and everything on your phone. Essentially, you can do everything off your phone. So when I did a comparison between the 6,500 watt inverters and the 18K PV, a lot of people had been asking me to do one of them and asking the differences and if it was worth doing that upgrade program they had before. One of the biggest things people mentioned, of course, the biggest was probably price, but right behind it would be redundancy. They liked the fact that with the 6,500 watt inverters, you could have at least one unit would still be running if something went down in an emergency. So if you're comparing the two of these, in an off-grid setting anyway, there's a lot of different things that could be said for this. I mean, I suppose I could do a comparison between these two, but one is a hybrid, one's not, similar to the one I did for the 6,500s. But a big factor here is if you did have, it depends. If you're going to get two of these and you needed 12,000 watts, which would be the same output as the 18K PV, a continuous output anyway, then these units would have more idle consumption, but you would have redundancy. If the unit goes down, you're still going to have at least 6,000 watts of split phase power. Also, if you're comparing this to the 6,500 watt inverters, if you wanted more than 12,000 watts, you had to add 2 more. So all of a sudden you're up to 24,000 watts, 24 kilowatts. Instead, with these, you could add 3 if you needed just a little bit more than 12,000. They're already split phase units. They do not have to be in pairs. You can add 3, mix and match, however you'd like, 5. I really love the fact that you can switch the AC power off, and that essentially means the unit's in standby. So you don't have to do any magic tricks like with the 6,500s where if you didn't have solar coming in, you had to program it super fast or whatever. This, you just turn that AC power off and it's in standby, and you can change settings that require standby. So I thought that was pretty cool. And I'll go over more options in the menu on the next one, but you can even adjust fan speeds on the unit. So it's way beyond any of the Voltronic units that you've looked at in the past. So there's a lot of people that are really excited about this unit. They want to be off-grid at an affordable price. And based off what I've seen so far, they should be excited. It's a really cool unit. So I'll leave a link in the description below to the 6000 XP if you guys are interested in reading up on the unit. The specs and the manual are on there also. And I appreciate you guys watching, and stay tuned.